You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Britta Bloomberg is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. Britta, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Oh, thank you.
Britta, about how many buildings in Minneapolis are registered as historic?
Well, our office is responsible for administering the National Register of Historic Places, and in the city of Minneapolis there are 115 listings for the National Register, and this includes a number of historic districts. So a listing isn't always just one building, for instance. It might include, and it does include, properties such as the Minneapolis Warehouse District or the St. Anthony Falls Historic District, which encompass large number of properties, not only buildings but also other kinds of structures. And so if you were to add all of those buildings up and other properties that are encompassed within the National Register in Minneapolis, it's probably well over 900 individual resources.
What qualifications does a building need in order to be put on a preservation list or labeled as historic?
Well, the National Register of Historic Places was established in 1966 with passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, and the criteria that are used for listing have not changed in the many years that this program has now been in place. And there are basically 4 criteria with numbered A, B, C, and D. The first criterion has to do with associations with important patterns in history. They can be at the national level, state level, or at the local level. So this is really historic significance as we identify it. Or the second criterion, B, has to do with associations with significant historic people. An example in Minneapolis might be there are a number of library buildings that are on the National Register, and they have an association for their, part of their listing is for their association with Gracia Countryman, who was a real mover and shaker in the public library movement. So she was really responsible for their listing or for their construction when they were built. And so a number of those libraries, people might not expect them to be listed for their association with a significant librarian, but because they also may possess significance because of their design. The third criterion has to do with design. Criterion C is really the design criteria. It has to do with significant for properties that are associated or significant for their design, the significance of their design. Many times when people think of the National Register, they think first of design. They think of the distinctive architectural gems in our community, and that is certainly one category of property that might be listed on the register, but not the only category. And then the fourth criterion is criterion D. It has to do with the data that a historic resource is apt to reveal. Usually this is a criterion that is associated with archaeological sites where the information is yet to be gathered, but it can also be associated with a standing structure or other kind of property. So really those 4 criteria are the measures against which all National Register properties have to be evaluated. But then you also look at whether or not historic properties still possess what we would call their design integrity. So they need to still be evocative of the period that they represent. They can't have undergone really drastic alterations, for instance, and still have sufficient historic integrity in order to convey the significance of the story that they tell.
And once a building is registered, what sort of protections does it receive?
There are a number of kinds of designations that historic properties can be given. This office works primarily with the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the nation's official listing of properties that have been deemed worthy of preservation. And the kinds of protections that this provides, the primary protection is actually one of recognition. It's a way to basically say this is an important property that's worthy of preservation, and by making that known, the hope is always that it will gain greater respect in the community on the part of the people that care for that building, and that in and of itself will have some influence on the protection of the resource. But the strongest protection in designation actually is at the local level, and the City of Minneapolis has a local Heritage Preservation Commission and has designated locally many properties. There's an excellent website that's been developed by the city, and they're well mapped out on that website. And under the city's ordinance, all the changes that require any kind of building permit are reviewed. So it's really the strongest teeth in historic preservation are really at the local level. So we work closely with a lot of local communities to encourage them to strengthen their local programs.
Who designates which buildings are registered, and how do they choose?
You know, that's a good question. The National Register is administered by the National Park Service in the Department of Interior in Washington. It's the keeper of the National Register. I've always thought that's a great title. But the keeper of the National Register makes the final decision. There's a long, involved process that's a very public process that goes into National Register designation that begins with public notification. Actually, it begins well before that. It begins with documenting the significance of a resource and preparing the National Register documentation. Once that documentation's been pulled together, it is reviewed by and administered. This is a program that's done in partnership with the state historic preservation offices all across the nation. So the documentation's reviewed in our office. It goes before a citizen board, the State Review Board, that is appointed by the state historic preservation officer. If they This is after there's been a public notice, and property owners and other members of the public are afforded the opportunity to comment on potential nominations. And if the review board recommends that the property be designated, it advances through the process. It goes from there to the State Historic Preservation Officer and then to the keeper of the National Register. So it's a lengthy process, really, that puts a great deal of rigor to the whole exercising of documenting and really testing whether or not a property meets the criteria, the very exacting criteria that are required of the register.
In your opinion, how does Minneapolis compare to other cities in regards to how well the city has preserved its architecture?
You know, each city has its own flavor or its own character, I would say. And certainly here in Minnesota, Minneapolis has one of the oldest historic preservation ordinances. I think a really important measure of a community's kind of strength of the local program is whether they have a local preservation ordinance. I think the fact that Minneapolis has one and that's been in place since the early 1970s speaks well for the city. I think, you know, the city certainly has it's been a very progressive city from the get-go, and many historic resources unfortunately have been lost over the years. But I think that particularly in more recent years, we've seen real increased effort on the part of the city to ensure that these treasures of the community are really not lost. So there's always a bit of give and take. Historic preservation is something that happens at the local level, and it's a process that is intensely local. The vast majority of properties that are on the National Register and that are locally designated are in private hands. And we live in a nation where private property rights are highly valued. And so that's why such things as education and the recognition that National Register designation gives are so important. It's a way to elevate the opinions of just the general public about a historic property, is that kind of designation that comes with it. But I think, Minneapolis certainly has been working hard at preservation for a long time. It's not without its local controversy, but but I think every community faces that.
You'd mentioned earlier some of the challenges you face when trying to get a particular building or site registered as an historic place. You mentioned property rights. Tell us about some of the challenges and how you face them.
Well, I think the public opinion is certainly one. For people to understand why these properties are significant, particularly when you look at, historic preservation encompasses not just those, as I mentioned earlier, those architectural gems in our communities. I think that those are often the easiest to advocate for. But many times really significant properties might be quite ordinary. And the other day I was driving down Washington Avenue and past the Milwaukee Road Depot, and remembering that it wasn't all that many years ago that building was vacant and threatened. And now it is really appreciated by so many. And as you think of the many people that are skating in that train shed, and the gatherings that occur in this, wonderful historic resource. It's hard for people to imagine that this building could have been lost, but it easily could have been.
Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer Britta Bloomberg, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
You're welcome.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at some of the most interesting buildings in Minneapolis.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.